Okay, so I'm back, part two. Continuing on in thinking about how we can explain differences between racial groups, the next thing I want to talk about is colorblind racism or colorblind racial ideology. Now, this one I need to note, this explanation is different than the other processes and mechanisms that I've described up to this point. This colorblind racism or colorblind racial ideology is a belief system. So whereas social networks and the wealth gap and racial residential segregation, those are more about mechanisms or processes related to racial inequality, colorblind racism is more of a belief system that kind of serves as the foundation for how we go about explaining those racial differences. And before I move on, let me also say this. So the thing about inequality, any inequality system, is that there has to be a belief system in place that legitimates it, that makes it seem okay, that justifies those inequalities to the public at large. In today's era, it is colorblind racial ideology that legitimates these racial differences between groups. This is the idea that because race no longer matters in American society, any differences we see between racial groups are as a result of anything but race. So it's a denial that race continues to play a factor in the way individual lives unfold in America. So for those that ascribe to a colorblind racial ideology, how do they go about explaining differences between racial groups? So if you don't think that race matters in American society anymore, but then you're presented with information that shows that whites make far more money than do Latinos and blacks, or that whites have more wealth, or that whites are incarcerated at much lower rates as compared to other racial groupings, how do you make sense of that if you're not going to attribute it to race? There's a couple of different frames or narratives associated with this colorblind racial ideology. So the first attributes differences in income, education, incarceration rates, etc., as a result of individual deficiencies. So the idea here is that in America, everyone has the potential to succeed if they work hard, if they make good decisions. And so for those that don't succeed, they have only themselves to blame, right? It's a denial that there are structural constraints that people face that might prevent them from achieving that success. Another colorblind explanation for differences between racial groups is the idea that some racial groups don't have the right values. This is a cultural deficiency argument, which is kind of the first one explained in that handout assigned with this week's material. And let me just emphasize right now that this explanation of cultural deficiency is highly non-sociological in nature, right? This is more of kind of a mainstream explanation you hear for differences in racial groups, but it's not one that sociologists tend to ascribe to, or at least not without considering how structure influences culture. So the problem with this line of thinking, with colorblind racial ideology, or the way that it helps perpetuate racial inequality, is that it does not take into account the historical legacy of race in our country and how we have yet to fully account for that historical legacy, or how race continues to play a major role in American life. So it kind of ignores this history of race that we're still trying to deal with and unpack, which again I'll speak about in just a moment. It fails to take into account the historical legacy. It also fails to take into account how race operates in contemporary society, which again is much more subtle, much more covert than what we saw pre-civil rights era. And so if you deny a problem exists, if you deny that race for people of color poses a barrier in American life, or for whites provides this unearned advantage, then why would you ever need to address it? I'm going to upload a clip that I want you to look at. It's a researcher, a sociologist, describing in an experimental design that she did that illustrates how race continues to operate as a barrier for people of color in American society. And this is just one of many, many studies that undermine this idea that race no longer matters. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about, kind of going again, so we spoke about a few of the mechanisms, the processes where that contribute to the maintenance of racial inequality. I just spoke very briefly about the belief system that this racial inequality rests upon. And then now the last thing that I want to talk about is this idea of structural racism. This is the idea that institutional barriers are constructed around the parameters of color that operate as obstacles to economic, educational, and social advancement. So really, this way of thinking about racism really relies on the historical legacy that I've been referring to throughout this lecture. So when you think about it, when you think about the history of America, for over 250 years, non-whites essentially lived in a dictatorship where they had absolutely no participation in politics or any other area of life. And furthermore, up until the 1960s, segregation was state sanctioned. So even after the institution of slavery was dismantled, Jim Crow popped up to take its place. And this was, largely recognized today that this was a highly oppressive system that marginalized people of color. And that remained largely intact until the 1960s, until the civil rights movement, the important civil rights movement. And so when you think about it, when we had all of this time for whites to kind of establish their dominance in a very explicit, overt way, and it's only been a few decades since we've started to even realize that or try to dismantle it, it's only reasonable to expect that there would still be kind of this historical baggage that we're working through to unpack. So in other words, in America, we have this long history of the government supporting a racial hierarchy that privileged whites over people of color. And it's only been a few decades since the state-sanctioned barriers were dismantled, and we're still seeing the effects of this today. So for example, for a long time, whites were the only ones who could hold positions of power in America, politically, economically, and social spheres. And so as a result of this, our cultural system kind of developed around this idea of whiteness as being the standard or as being the norm. And so if white leadership is considered the normal, what we see happening today is that minority leadership is often perceived as threatening, if even unconsciously so. I'm not saying that people feel openly or consciously threatened whenever they're confronted with a person of color in a position of leadership. It's again going back to something I referenced last week of this idea of cultural racism, this uncognitive bias that gets queued up in people's minds. And let's not dismiss the institutional barriers that are still alive and well with us today. One of the most glaring examples of this would be the criminal justice system. And unfortunately, we have many examples that we can point to of recent incidences that have received a lot of attention, where we see race-based police harassment and assault of people of color, it has resulted in massive amounts of social movements. And another example to consider, so in some states, the sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine are 500 times greater than for powder cocaine, even though crack comes from cocaine. And one of the major differences between these two drugs is the usage, where African Americans tend to use crack cocaine more in higher concentrations, and whites, and cocaine is associated with whites. Although I should say that there has been some attempt to kind of redress these sentencing disparities between crack cocaine and cocaine, recognizing kind of the racial implications behind these things. So that is all that I have this week. I hope that this unit has provided some clarity for some of you. It probably provided some validation for others, and I suspect that it may have challenged a few of you as well. But again, I think I've probably mentioned it before, but if not, I'm going to give it a go now. What is the point of a higher education if not to be challenged, if not to be pushed a little bit? Okay, that's it for now. I will see you fine folks next week. Have a good one.